Good morning. Today in our daily Devo, we're going to finish out chapter 4 of Genesis. We have seen last week how Cain murdered his brother Abel. And then we pick up today in verse 16, and we're told that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. He lived in the land of Nod, east of Jordan, east of Eden. And then the Bible tells us that Cain had a son. It says he made love to his wife. She became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain built a city. He named the city after his boy Enoch. You're going to see some familiar names in the next few verses. Names like Enoch and Methuselah and Lamech. You'll see these names again in chapter 5, but they're different people. These boys were descendants of Cain. And when we get to chapter 5, we will see the descendants of Seth. And the children might have similar names, but they are not the same people whatsoever. Cain was a murderer. And if you look at his descendants, many of them also did things that were evil. Verse 19 tells us that Lamech married 2 women. That's a mistake. He's the first bigamist. And then it mentions 3 of his sons. One was named Jebul, and he was the father of those who work with livestock. So that's what he did. And then he had another son named Jubal. It says he's the father of those who play stringed instruments. So we have one boy who is into livestock. We have another who is a musician. And then verse 22 tells us the third son was named Tubal-Cain, and he forged tools out of bronze. So he did metal work. So we know what they do for a living, but what we don't see are descendants who have a heart for God. They're not known for following the Lord. In fact, the Bible tells us that Lamech was a murderer just like Cain. In verse 23, he said to his 2 wives, "I killed a man for wounding me." So he got injured, but did the other man deserve to be murdered? So I know all of that is bad news, but these are the descendants of Cain. We finally get some good news in verse 25. Adam and Eve get pregnant again. It says Adam made love to his wife, and she gave birth to a son named Seth. And they began to rejoice. She said, now God has given me another child in place of Abel, who Cain killed. So we conclude in verse 26 by telling us that Seth also had a son and named him Enosh. So Seth is the son of Adam. He's a good boy. We're going to see his descendants in chapter 5. But at the very end of chapter 4, finally something positive. The scripture says, at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking it's about time. People began to call on the name of the Lord. That means they called out to God in prayer. The Hebrew word also indicates they called out to him in worship. They called on the name of the Lord. So we have 2 different fathers, Cain and Seth, and their descendants were very different as well. From Seth, we're going to see descendants in chapter 5 leading up to Noah, who helped to rebuild, repopulate the earth after the flood. As parents, how you raise your children and the spiritual heritage you give to them is so very important. And you can't give to them something that you don't possess. And so if you want to, if we want to change this world in which we live in, we're going to need to do that one person at a time. And it starts with fathers and mothers passing on their spiritual faith to their children. You can teach what you know, but you reproduce who you are. And what I mean by that is if you want to have godly kids, be a godly father, Be a godly mother, because they're going to be looking at your example more than anything else. Godliness is more caught than taught. And so as we finish out the 4th chapter, I just see a contrast in fathers, in parenting. You don't want to follow in the path of Cain. You do want to follow in the path of Seth. And it says, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So how about at this time, as we conclude our Devo, spend a little time calling out on the name of the Lord. Spend a little bit of time in prayer.